In this episode, we are going to talk about a very important chapter in the history of British imperial expansion in northwest India, involving the annexation of Punjab. As you know, Punjab eventually emerged as a very important resource for the empire by supplying a huge manpower in the army, and also it was agriculturally rich province. But we are concerned today with the history of British occupation of Punjab in 1849, and we try to explain it in terms of the kind of sense of insecurity that the British felt as far as the northwestern frontier was concerned. And in an attempt to explain this, we have to emphasize two basic points. What was really the British interest in establishing direct control over the Punjab? And secondly, what was the immediate context? What were the conditions in Punjab that actually invited the British intervention? Finally, drawing the curtain on Ranjit Singh's kingdom, pensioning of the young prince Dalip Singh to England, where he ultimately spent the rest of his life as an exile. And our explanation also will concentrate on how the internal configuration in Punjab was a very important factor in creating the condition in which intervention by the British became possible. So these are basically the basic points concerning the history of this annexation. Before you actually get into the history of how Punjab was annexed, it is important to locate a very significant change in the nature of British imperialism in the early part of the 19th century. The British became more aggressive, particularly after the Marathas were vanquished in 1818. After the settlement of the Marathas, that gave the British a measure of self-confidence. They became more aggressive at one level, they became more interfering at another level. Occasions of intervention in many of these princely states with whom the British had established treaty relationships became more frequent. Threats of deposition began to hang over the heads of many of these princely rulers, and British rulers often claimed that they needed to replace these princely rulers in order to bring the inhabitants of these princely states under the more benevolent government of the British. They often had this habit of describing these princely rulers as examples, as vestiges of Oriental misgovernment. So this is certainly a very significant change in the imperial policy, in imperial attitudes. The kind of reticence or the kind of caution that early imperialism practiced was discarded in favor of a more aggressive policy. This particular trend climaxed in the 1840s. During 1848, as you know, when Governor General Dalhousie embarked on a systematic policy of annexation of the territories of many of the more prominent princely states, including Awadh. Awadh was annexed in 1856. So annexation of Punjab forms a very important chapter in this history of a new kind of imperialism that began to surface its head from the early part of the 19th century. One can trace the beginning from the time of Wellesley, of course, but as you know, Wellesley was actually discouraged by the authorities in London, and he was in fact recalled for being spendthrift, for the useless expenses that he had incurred in many of the Indian wars that Wellesley's establishment had fought. But from 1820s onwards, we can also see a change in the policy of the British authorities in London. They were now becoming more indulgent. They were now becoming more supportive. And in 1813 came a Governor General, Hastings of Moira, who spelt it out with a certain notion of paramountcy.
Sir,
Yes?
what was this paramountcy and what was its implication?
Oh, paramountcy is actually a claim of overlordship. The Hastings of Moira, who was the Governor General from 1813 onwards, and during his time, in fact, the interventionism was revived after a gap of a few years when the company's authorities in London had given a mandate for non-intervention. The paramountcy, as a theory, tried to establish the authority of the British Empire over these princely states. I mean, the princely states were tied in treaty relationship with the company, but the paramountcy tried to define a relationship by which the company was the superior, the company was the boss, and these princely states, whatever be their status, even if you have a large state like Hyderabad, the Hyderabad also had to accept the dictates of the company's authorities. This is actually the meaning of paramountcy. But in the long run, as you can see, paramountcy also involved these occasions for more direct intervention by the British, to the extent or to the point of the government of the princely states being directly taken over by the British authorities. So you can see a change also. If paramountcy implied the superior position of the company vis-a-vis the princely states, the paramountcy also implied in the long run a shift towards a position where the company would become so interfering that the existence of these princely states would also be threatened. So this is the reason why I would argue that annexation of Punjab has to be located, has to be situated in this larger historical backdrop of a new kind of imperialism which was becoming more aggressive, more interfering, more conscious about the security of the empire. Now, this particular aspect of the security of the empire actually brings us face to face with a situation in Punjab after the collapse of Ranjit Singh's kingdom. This was in the fourth decade of the 19th century when intervention in this region, not just in Punjab but also in Sindh, because Sindh was annexed in 1839, to a large extent such interventions were provoked by the fear of a troubled frontier. Because once Ranjit Singh's kingdom collapsed, instability became rampant. In this kind of an endemic instability, the British authorities were fearful about a possible Russian advance, Russian intervention in the region. This is what is called Russophobia. The possible intervention by the Russians in the region were provoking them or were persuading the British to take a new look at the policy. The policy that they had pursued earlier was to prop up Ranjit Singh's regime as a possible bulwark against invasions from the northwest, a barrier against the Afghans, a barrier against possible invaders from the northwestern region. But once Ranjit Singh was not there, this policy had to be changed.
Sir, how was this stability achieved by Ranjit Singh?
This is actually a question that requires us to go back in time to the 18th century. The situation in Punjab in the 18th century, which became extremely troubled as a consequence of the decline of the Mughal Empire. There were frequent invasions from the northwest. Nadir Shah came to India via that route. Later, Ahmad Shah Abdali, who was firmly anchored in Afghanistan, in Kabul, made Punjab a target, and certain regions of Punjab were occupied by Abdali as the Mughal emperor actually ceded them to Abdali in order to buy peace. It is in this context of some kind of anarchy in the region, some kind of instability in the region, the Sikh Sardars, and this also takes you to the Sikh movement, because it was basically an agrarian movement of the peasantry and local zamindars who were attracted to Sikhism and who were actually fighting a prolonged war of resistance against the Mughals. So on one side you have this resistance against the Mughals. Since the time of Guru Gobind, or this tradition was continued by Banda Bahadur. On the other side you have the need to resist the Afghans, to contain the Afghans. And you have the relative instability in the region which was affecting agriculture and trade. It is in this kind of a situation that many of the Sikh leaders managed to establish their little kingdoms in the later half of the 19th century, to create a kind of a centrifugal Sikh polity, with the memory of Sikh resistance against the Mughal as a kind of ideological support, with the compulsion of containing the Afghans as a kind of military necessity that was demanding the emergence of a more organized, more powerful leadership. In order to understand the conditions in which the emergence of Ranjit Singh as a powerful Sikh leader was possible, you have to look at the later half of the 18th century when many of the local Sikh Sardars were setting up their own little kingdoms in the agrarian regions of Punjab, in the Doabs. There were many Doabs. You have Bari Doab, Jalandhar Doab, Rachna Doab, Sindh Sagar Doab. This entire region is crisscrossed by these many rivers, 5 rivers. In that troubled condition, these Sikh Sardars, locally powerful bosses, or locally powerful leaders, created certain institutions. For example, you have this institution of Rakhi, whereby they promised protection for a certain amount of revenue, for a certain amount of resource, that the peasants were obliged to offer them in return for protection. And those who were capable of offering such protection were able to creating missiles, local military communities, or a community which was held together by a common allegiance to the community which had been bonded by the Sikh Panth since the time of Guru Gobind. So an allegiance to the Panth, allegiance to the community, was the ideological cement that held many of these missiles together to create a kind of Sikh polity based on Dal Khalsa on the one hand, the military wing of it, and Gurmat on the other. The Gurmat is basically a kind of consensual decision that these leaders were actually arriving at about what to do with their own little kingdoms, what to do with the life of the community, etc. And such decisions were usually taken at Amritsar, but one could perhaps arrive at this kind of a consensual decision or Gurmat even in a battlefield. The idea was that in order to bind this community together, as it was trying to fight out its existence with different kinds of enemies in the region, it was important to sanctify all the decisions that the community leaders were taking with reference to the Guru. So these are some of the institutions, some of the ideas which lent a measure of stability, attempts by the Sikh leaders to create a stable order. As you come to the question of how Ranjit Singh emerged as a powerful Sikh leader, you have to consider this old point of containment of an enemy. And in this particular case, we have Zaman Shah from Kabul. Zaman Shah was a successor of Abdali, and Zaman Shah was actually looking at this alluvial, fertile region, which demanded a certain kind of resistance by the Sikhs, who had already become very powerful in the Doabs as leaders of the missiles. So it was this necessity that eventually made for the rise of Ranjit Singh, a member of the Sukarchakia missile, as the leading Sikh leader.
What was the source of the strength for Ranjit Singh?
The main source of strength for Ranjit Singh was his army. The army which was modelled on European East India Company's army. The cavalry was well organized. It was officered and trained by Europeans. You have this system of vassalage that Ranjit Singh introduced, that all these great chiefs in other places became his vassals. But as you know, vassalage was only a step towards final subjugation of these Sikh leaders by Ranjit Singh. There was a period of expansion also. Initially, once Ranjit Singh was firmly established in Lahore in 1799, then Amritsar came under his control in 1805, and the control over the holy city of Amritsar gave Ranjit Singh a certain advantage. And with his control established in the Doabs, he began to move further westwards and northwards, bringing under his control the hill chiefs in Jammu and Kangra and containing the Afghans. The Afghan strongholds at Multan or at Peshawar fell one after another. So this was how the basis of a powerful kingdom was created, and this powerful kingdom was capable of generating a measure of prosperity as well. It was natural for Ranjit Singh to look after irrigation facilities for the peasants, because ultimately the Sikh state was a peasant state. I mean, the main support base was the rural peasantry, the Jat Sikhs basically, who were agriculturists. But at the same time, the kind of security that the Ranjit Singh regime had been able to bring about in Punjab at the close of the 18th century, with the memory of great dislocation in the earlier part of the 18th century in the backdrop, the trade that had shrunk in the earlier part of the century had begun to revive. So trade brought prosperity, greater income. Artisanal industry began to flourish. Lahore once again became an important center of artisanal production. So it was not just a kind of a military state that Ranjit Singh was able to create. This military state could draw on huge economic resources as well, resources generated by agriculture, by the revival of trade, by revival of handicrafts. And that, I think, gave Ranjit Singh the kind of power that he was able to wield over the entire region, the kind of power with which he was able to pacify the other Sikh chiefs, keep them under his control, gradually expanding the territory, bringing them under a network of vassalage before they became parts of directly ruled territory. The stable political order, however, didn't have a long life after Ranjit Singh's death. In June 1839, he died, and his death was followed by the usual factional and family rivalries. And that situation of relative instability made for an important change in British policy, a departure from the position that the British had taken in 1809 in the Treaty of Amritsar. The Treaty of Amritsar had accepted Ranjit Singh as the sole sovereign ruler of the Punjab, looking upon Ranjit Singh's kingdom as a possible buffer against invaders, allowing Ranjit Singh to contain the Afghans by expanding westwards. Once Ranjit Singh was not there, once the regime was threatening to split into factions, was actually the family itself became divided, the British had to also change their position, their priorities, particularly because of this fear that I was talking about, the fear of an invader, the Russians in particular. Situation after 1839 was very troublesome. Kharak Singh was the nominee. Kharak Singh, one of Ranjit Singh's sons, became the ruler. That was Ranjit Singh's desire, and Ranjit Singh also decided that Dhyan Singh would be his wazir, but Kharak Singh didn't have a long life. He was not strong enough, so taking advantage of his weaknesses, his son, now Nihal Singh, started managing the affairs of the state. But also Nihal Singh didn't live long. When he was returning from the funeral of Kharak Singh, they had an accident. Nihal Singh died. Sher Singh, the eldest son of Ranjit Singh, became the ruler, but didn't have a very safe tenure because constantly he had troubles. One group of Sikh leaders would be pitted against Sher Singh. There will be another group supporting him. So the family itself became divided. The court at Lahore became a hotbed of intrigues. Chand Kaur, the mother of Nihal Singh, actually became an enemy of Sher Singh and was claiming that she should function as a regent till Nihal Singh's widow gave birth to a posthumous child. And now it was the turn of Nihal Singh to ensure the forced abortion of that child, and Chand Kaur died under mysterious circumstances and he got implicated in this. So all this is indicative of how the polity that Ranjit Singh had been able to create, how the stable political order that Ranjit Singh had been able to create was fragmenting, was splitting up. The family group was splitting up. The aristocrats, the Sikh leaders were becoming divided. One group supporting one claimant for throne, another group another claimant for throne. So this was the situation which was actually presaging, which was actually facilitating, calling for a change in British policy. And the British were taking advantage of the troubled waters.
Sir, can we say that the same story also continued in Punjab where the British took advantage of the internal conflicts?
Certainly. You see the repetition of the same story and also the repetition of a similar story that you have seen elsewhere in India, that one of the factions would eventually invite the British to intervene. So when Sher Singh, for example, was trying to contain his enemies, both Sher Singh's party and the rival party would actually approach the British for some kind of support and protection. Now this would become more dangerous around 1843, when these palace intrigues and these troubles would lead to a bloody climax. Sher Singh was killed by one of the groups known as the Sandhanwalia family group, which was pitted against Sher Singh. Sher Singh had already earlier taken their Jagir. Only at the intervention of the British some kind of settlement was reached, but the Sandhanwalias didn't actually favor him. So the enmity was so strong that they decided to kill him along with one of his sons. And at that hour, an infant son of Ranjit Singh named Dilip Singh became the ruler with the support of one of these groups. And the situation became so volatile that the Council of Regency, which was headed by Rani Jindan, in fact carried on secret negotiations with the British for providing Dilip Singh with a protective cover. So that was the occasion when the intervention eventually took place, around 1845-46. There was a premeditated war. The British mobilized their army on the other side of Sutlej. The Sikh army became somewhat independent of the control of the palace or of the control of the rulers. The Sikh army became excited by the presence of the British on the other side of the Sutlej. The Sikh army crossed the river. The British intervened. Wars were fought. Eventually, the Sikh army lost out. A treaty was signed in March 1846, which accepted Jindan's Council of Regency. But Jindan eventually learnt the hard way how treacherous the British were as friends. In December 1846, another treaty was signed, in terms of which Jindan was pensioned off. And she had nothing else to do. She had to accept. Two major functionaries were also removed. The entire power in the state was taken over by the British resident, who was now a permanent fixture in the Dilip Singh's court. The British army was stationed at Lahore. So virtually control was established by early 1847. Still, Punjab was a kind of a princely state under the control of the British resident, whose authority was recognized by the Treaty of December 1846. Between this position and annexation in 1849, it was a small step, because such a prominent presence of the British, the resident trying to control the government, the attempt by the resident to undermine the Council of Regency, the attempt by the resident to pension of Rani Jindan, all this created a certain kind of grievance in the Punjab, and there were resistance against it. And such resistance led to a series of another set of wars, the wars at Chilianwala, and finally the British won the victory in the Battle of Gujarat. And after their victory in the Battle of Gujarat, they forced Dalip Singh, the infant ruler, to sign the document of annexation. Dalip Singh was sent out to England and he lived the rest of his life in England as an exile. So, annexation undertaken by Dalhousie in 1849. Dalhousie came to India in 1848. I have talked about his aggressive imperial policy, was a logical outcome of the kind of opportunity that the British received or British got in 1845-46 to intervene in Punjab more strongly, more directly, by a radical departure from the position that they had taken in 1809 in the Treaty of Amritsar. So, by way of recapitulating some of the points that we have made in the course of this discussion, we have made the point that the annexation of Punjab in 1849 has to be located in the larger backdrop in a new kind of imperial policy that you see from 1820s onwards. Imperialism was becoming more aggressive, more interfering, more expansionist. It started with Hastings of Moira, but then it reached its climax in Dalhousie in 1848, and in 1849 Punjab was annexed. It has to be, the British intervention in Punjab has to be studied in terms of a departure of British policy, the policy that they had adopted in 1809, and this was warranted by the troubled conditions in Punjab, which created the fear of a possible intervention by somebody from the northwest threatening the security of the British Empire, Russophobia that I was referring to. And thirdly, intervention in Punjab, that which actually led to the final annexation in 1849, was a consequence of the division in the Punjab polity. The rival groups of aristocrats competing for power, the rival family groups looking for the throne, all these rival groups were actually trying to forge connections with the British for their protection, and that gave the opportunity to the British to make their presence felt in the Punjab by stationing the resident, by stationing the army, by making the resident all powerful in 1845-46, even before the annexation had taken place.